The ritual required each participant to experience a moment of perfect agony, a spike of suffering so intense that it burned itself into the fundamental structure of reality. That pain became the anchor, the connection point between consciousness and matter. We exist now in a state of permanent low-grade discomfort, a background ache that never quite rises to the level of torture, but never quite fades into numbness. It is the price of remaining sane in bodies that have been claimed by powers that exist beyond sanity. I felt my stomach turn. The theological implications alone would keep scholars busy for centuries, assuming anyone survived to study this. The Imperium's doctrine was clear that the human soul belonged in the human body, that consciousness and flesh were inseparable aspects of the same divine creation. What these people had done was a fundamental violation of that principle, a reorganization of human existence along lines that the Emperor himself might not recognize as properly human anymore. And yet, they were still here, still thinking, still capable of conversation and social organization and apparently ethical reasoning, given the guilt I could hear in their voices when they described what they'd done to survive. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You must know what I am, what I represent. The Inquisition doesn't negotiate with corruption. We don't make exceptions for good intentions or extenuating circumstances. What you've described is heresy so profound that it demands exterminatus, planetary annihilation to ensure no trace of this contamination spreads beyond this system. You're giving me everything I need to justify dropping cyclonic torpedoes on this world until the crust liquefies." Mara met my eyes, and in her gaze, I saw something that made me profoundly uncomfortable, because I recognized it from my own reflection on the mornings after particularly difficult interrogations. It was the look of someone who had made peace with their own damnation, who had walked so far into the darkness that the light behind them had become irrelevant to their continued journey. "Because we need you to understand," she said. "Because in 243 years of isolation, you are the first person from outside this world to set foot on our soil and survive long enough to learn what we are. Because there are things happening here that go beyond our individual survival. Patterns emerging in the warp taint that suggests the powers that claimed us are not finished with their work. Because we are afraid, Interrogator Vex. Afraid in ways that you cannot imagine unless you've lived in flesh that belongs to nightmares while trying to hold on to thoughts that belong to humanity. We need you to take this information back to the Imperium, to tell them what is possible, what the Ruinous Powers are experimenting with in the dark corners of the galaxy where the Astronomican's light no longer reaches." She moved closer, and I could smell her now. That strange, not quite right scent that characterized this world. Up close, her corruption was more obvious, her skin showing patterns that repeated at microscopic scales, fractals of mutation that suggested her cellular structure had been rewritten at the molecular level. "The demon worlds you've encountered before are weapons," she continued. "They're staging grounds for invasions, factories for producing possessed warriors and demonic engines, symbols of the Chaos God's power meant to terrify Imperial populations into submission. But this world is different. This world is an experiment. The powers that claimed us are studying what happens when human consciousness persists through corruption, when the thinking mind remains intact while the physical form is transformed. They're learning, Interrogator. They're developing new techniques, new approaches to the eternal war between the Materium and the Immaterium. And when they perfect what they're testing here, when they find a way to create possessed populations that retain enough intelligence to operate technology and maintain infrastructure, they will have a weapon that your Imperium is not prepared to face. The weight of her words settled over me like a shroud. She was right, and the recognition of that rightness made me want to vomit. A possessed population that could still think, still plan, still operate as a coherent civilization while serving the interests of the Ruinous Powers would be a nightmare beyond calculation. The Imperium's defenses assumed that demonic corruption destroyed higher cognitive function, that the possessed became mindless beasts driven only by immediate bloodlust and the base desires of their masters. We could handle beasts. We'd been handling beasts for 10,000 years. But what if the beasts learned to build starships? What if they maintained supply chains and strategic planning? What if they looked human enough to infiltrate, think clearly enough to deceive, yet remained fundamentally loyal to powers that sought humanity's complete annihilation? Show me, I said. Show me evidence of this experimentation. Show me proof that what you're describing isn't just paranoia born from 2 centuries of isolation. Because if I'm going to take this back to the Inquisition, if I'm going to argue for anything other than immediate exterminatus, I need to give them something concrete. Mara nodded slowly. Follow me. There is a place in the old capital, in the ruins of what was once our planetary governor's palace. The powers that transformed us maintain a presence there. A monitoring station, I suppose you would call it. They observe us, take measurements, adjust variables in the corruption that sustains our transformed state. We are not permitted to enter, but we can see it from the outside. We can show you the mechanisms of our damnation. The journey to the old capital took 3 days. We traveled on foot, Mara and I, and a small group of her people who served as guides through the transformed landscape. I maintained contact with a vigil via Vox, checking in every 6 hours to confirm I hadn't been compromised. Captain Aldrich grew increasingly anxious with each report, his concern evident even through the distortion that plagued our communications. The ship's augurs continued to track strange energy patterns across the planet's surface, flows of power that suggested active warp manipulation beyond what should be possible in stable real space. The land we crossed was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. Forests grew in spiral patterns, their trees arranged in mathematical precision that suggested conscious design rather than natural growth. Rivers flowed uphill when the local geometry demanded it, water defying gravity to follow paths that made sense according to rules I couldn't perceive. The sky continued its subtle flickering between colors, and I began to notice that the transitions corresponded to emotional states, as though the atmosphere itself was responding to the collective mood of the population. When we passed through a village where a celebration was underway, the sky shone with a warmth that approached normal sunlight. When we skirted the ruins of a town that had been too close to a major warp breach during the initial invasion, the sky darkened to a bruised purple that made my chest tight with sympathetic dread. My guide spoke freely during our journey, answering questions I hadn't known I needed to ask. They described the hierarchy of their society, how communities had organized themselves in the aftermath of the transformation. They explained the limitations of their existence, the anchor points that kept them from straying too far from their home territories, the constant background discomfort that reminded them their consciousness was no longer housed solely in flesh. They talked about children born after the fall, offspring of transformed parents who came into the world already corrupted but somehow still possessed of human awareness, their souls bound to the planet at the moment of their first breath. Those children disturbed me more than anything else I'd seen. They had never known normal human existence. They had grown up in bodies that violated reality, surrounded by a society that remembered being something they would never be. Yet they laughed and played and showed curiosity about the stranger from the stars walking among them. They were children in every way that mattered, despite the fact that their flesh belonged to nightmares and their existence was a theological impossibility. On the evening of the second day, we camped on a hillside overlooking a vast valley where the old capital had stood. The ruins sprawled across the landscape like the skeleton of a dead god. Structures that had once housed millions, now reduced to twisted frameworks that defied perspective. At the center of the ruins, rising like a tumor from the corpse of civilization, was a structure that hurt to look at directly. It was a tower, or something that approximated a tower if towers could exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. It rose impossibly high, its peak vanishing into clouds that formed only around it, spiraling up toward a point that might have been touching the sky or might have been folding through space to emerge somewhere else entirely. Its surface writhed with patterns that might have been architectural features or might have been living organisms. Structures that grew and receded in rhythms that suggested breath or heartbeat, or the pulse of something more fundamental than either. "That is where they watch from," Mara said, her voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "The lesser powers that claimed our world. They are not demons in the traditional sense, not discrete entities that can be named and banished. They are more like extensions of the warp itself, pseudopods of chaos reaching into reality to conduct research on how best to corrupt what they find here. They have been studying us since the fall, adjusting our conditions, introducing new variables to see how we adapt. We are their laboratory, and they are patient in ways that you cannot imagine." I pulled out a portable auspex and scanned the tower, though I suspected the readings would be useless. The device immediately began generating nonsense data. Numbers that cycled through impossible values, physical constants that fluctuated between states that couldn't coexist. Radiation levels spiked from 0 to lethal and back again. Temperature readings showed the tower as simultaneously absolute 0 and hot enough to vaporize adamantium. The only consistent reading was the warp signature, which pegged every detector at maximum and stayed there. A screaming presence that indicated concentrated Imperium energy of a type and intensity I'd never encountered outside the Eye of Terror itself. "What are they studying?" I asked. "What specifically are they trying to learn from you?" Mara was silent for a long moment, her form flickering in the fading light. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she'd been waiting 2 centuries to answer that question for someone who might actually do something with the answer. "They are studying pain," she said. "Not the simple pain of physical injury, but existential pain, the suffering that comes from awareness of one's own corruption. They want to know how much agony a conscious mind can endure before it breaks, how long awareness can persist in a body that has been fundamentally violated. They vary the parameters of our corruption, make some of us more twisted while allowing others to maintain forms closer to baseline human. They observe how we interact, how we form communities, how we build meaning in lives that should be meaningless. They are quantifying suffering, creating mathematical models of damnation, preparing for the day when they can apply these lessons on a galactic scale." She turned to me, and in the dying light, her eyes were very human, despite everything else about her that wasn't. "They are learning how to break humanity without destroying consciousness. They are perfecting the art of eternal torture while keeping the victim aware enough to understand their state. And when they succeed, when they can replicate what happened here across 1,000 worlds, 1,000,000 worlds, they will have transformed the nature of the Long War. They will have found a way to corrupt the Imperium from within, while preserving enough human infrastructure that those worlds can continue to contribute to the greater conflict. Imagine a Forge world where the tech priests retain their knowledge but serve the Ruinous Powers. Imagine an agri-world where the farmers remember their craft but grow crops saturated with warp taint. Imagine a billion worlds like ours, functioning and aware and utterly damned. I looked at the tower and felt something in me crumble. A wall I'd built between professional duty and human empathy finally giving way under the weight of what I was witnessing. These people weren't monsters. They weren't willing servants of chaos. They were victims. 7 billion victims who had made an impossible choice and were still paying for it 2.5 centuries later. They were being used as research subjects in an experiment that could doom the entire Imperium if it succeeded. And my orders, the protocols drilled into me through decades of service, demanded I call down exterminatus and eliminate the threat regardless of the cost to the population. Mercy was not a factor in inquisitorial calculus. Only security mattered. Only the protection of humanity as a species, even if individual humans had to be sacrificed by the billion. I need to enter that tower, I said. I need to gather evidence, proof that can be presented to the inquisitorial conclave. Testimony alone won't be enough to change established doctrine. They'll need data, recordings, something concrete that can't be dismissed as the rambling of a population driven mad by long isolation. Mara shook her head. No human has entered that structure and emerged with their sanity intact. The few who tried in the early years after the fall came back, changed in ways that made our corruption look gentle by comparison. Their consciousness was shattered, their ability to maintain coherent thought stripped away, leaving them as drooling husks that we had to mercy kill because death was kinder than what they'd become. The tower is protected by forces that specifically target the human mind, defenses designed to unmake thought itself as punishment for intrusion. Then I'll go alone, I said. No point in risking your people further. If I fall, if I'm corrupted or destroyed, you can tell Captain Aldrich what happened. He'll make his own decision about how to proceed. But I didn't come this far to turn back now. The old man who had first greeted me placed a hand on my shoulder, and through my armor, I could feel the wrongness of his touch. Fingers that had too many joints pressing against ceramite with force that suggested enhanced strength. You are braver than you are wise, Interrogator. But we understand duty. We remember what it meant to serve something greater than ourselves. We will guide you as far as we can, to the very threshold of that cursed place. After that, you walk alone, and may whatever gods still listen have mercy on your soul. We descended into the ruins at dawn, when the light had that particular quality that makes shadows seem deeper by contrast. The old capital had been called Zenith, a name chosen during the optimistic early days of colonization when humanity still believed it could tame the galaxy through simple determination and faith. Now it was a necropolis, a monument to the failure of that belief. Buildings leaned at impossible angles, their structural integrity maintained by forces that had nothing to do with engineering. Streets curved back on themselves in loops that seemed to cover distance without actually going anywhere. The air tasted of copper and ozone and something sweetly rotten that made my throat constrict. We saw other inhabitants as we moved through the ruins, transformed citizens of Zenith going about their daily routines in the wreckage of their former civilization. They had adapted to the broken architecture, moving through spaces that should have been impassable, their corrupted forms allowing them to navigate geometries that normal humans would find disorienting. They watched us pass with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity. And I realized they knew where I was going, knew what I was attempting, and had already written me off as another casualty of the tower's defenses. The structure grew larger as we approached, looming over the ruins in a way that had nothing to do with actual height. It was big, yes, perhaps a kilometer tall if measured by conventional means. But it felt bigger than that, as though it occupied more space than its physical dimensions suggested. The patterns on its surface moved faster as we got closer, swirling in configurations that tried to form symbols or letters before dissolving back into abstract chaos. I caught glimpses of words and languages I didn't recognize, mathematical formulas that made my eyes water, diagrams of human anatomy labeled with terms that suggested functions no human body had ever performed. We stopped at what my guides identified as the threshold, a boundary marked by nothing visible but felt as a pressure change in the air, a sudden weight that made breathing require conscious effort. Beyond that line, they explained, their anchor points could not sustain them. If they crossed, their consciousness would begin to fragment, drawn toward the tower itself, which exerted a pull on souls that outmatched even the planetary binding. "This is where we leave you," Mara said. She pulled something from inside her tunic and pressed it into my hand. It was a small stone, smooth and unremarkable except for the warmth it carried, heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with a heartbeat. "This is a piece of the planet, taken from the original binding site where the ritual was first performed. It carries an echo of our collective consciousness, a fragment of 7 billion souls compressed into physical matter. Keep it with you. If you begin to lose yourself in there, if the tower's defenses start to unravel your thoughts, focus on this stone. Let it remind you of what you are, of the difference between your consciousness and the chaos that seeks to unmake it." I closed my fist around the stone and felt it pulse against my palm. "If I don't come back," I said, "tell Aldrich to wait exactly 24 hours. If he hasn't heard from me by then, he should translate to the warp immediately and make for the nearest inquisitorial fortress. The information you've given me is too important to risk on a rescue attempt." "We will tell him," the old man said. "And if you do come back, if you survive what waits in there, perhaps you will understand something that we learned too late. There are worse things than death, Interrogator. There are states of existence where death would be a blessing, where consciousness becomes its own torture simply by continuing. Remember that when you face what lies ahead. Remember that mercy sometimes means knowing when to stop fighting." I crossed the threshold and immediately felt the difference. The air on the other side was thicker, more resistant to movement, as though I'd stepped from atmosphere into some denser medium. Sound changed quality, my breathing echoing back at me from multiple directions simultaneously. The tower loomed directly ahead, perhaps 50 meters away, its entrance a wound in reality that opened into darkness so absolute it seemed to radiate shadow rather than merely representing the absence of light. I activated every ward I carried, every protection that the Ordo Malleus had granted me for operations in warp-tainted environments. My rosette grew hot against my chest, its machine spirit screaming warnings and binaric pulses that my armor's systems translated into blunt danger notifications. My psychic hood, rarely needed since I possessed minimal psyker abilities myself, suddenly made sense to have brought its field generators humming to life as they detected the ocean of Imperium energy I was wading into. Each step toward the tower was a battle, not against physical resistance, but against the growing sense that moving forward was somehow moving backward, that I was walking away from the entrance even as I approached it. Distance became meaningless, measurements impossible. I would take 10 steps and seem to cover no ground. Then one step would place me 20 meters closer without any sense of having crossed the intervening space. Time stuttered, my chronometer showing seconds passing at irregular intervals, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow, occasionally running backward for brief instants before correcting itself with jarring speed. I reached the entrance and looked into darkness that was not darkness, void that was not void, absence that somehow contained presence. From within came sounds that were not sounds, vibrations that bypassed my ears entirely to resonate directly in my skull. Voices spoke in languages that had never been human, discussing topics that human thought could not encompass, debating conclusions drawn from premises that reality itself would reject. I stepped inside, and the universe inverted. There is no way to describe what I experienced in the tower that would make sense to anyone who hasn't felt their consciousness stretched across dimensions that don't exist in baseline reality. The interior was vast, impossibly vast, a space that could not possibly fit within the structure's exterior dimensions, yet somehow did. Rooms and corridors and chambers extending in directions that had no names in any human geometry. The walls were transparent, but not transparent, showing views of places that might have been different locations on the planet, or might have been entirely different realities bleeding through from adjacent dimensions. I saw Zenith as it had been before the fall, a thriving city of millions, streets filled with citizens going about their lives in blissful ignorance of the doom that waited overhead. I saw it during the invasion, demons pouring from tiers in space, while armies fought and died in battles that lasted subjectively for moments, but objectively for decades. I saw the moment of the great ritual. 7 billion souls screaming in unison as they severed themselves from their flesh and bound their consciousness to stone and soil and water. I saw the aftermath, the transformed population stumbling through their new existence, learning to pilot bodies that no longer obeyed familiar rules. And I saw what came next. Timelines that hadn't happened yet. Futures that branched from this moment like fractal patterns spiraling into infinity. I saw Kyros spreading its corruption to other worlds. The technique perfected and replicated, demon worlds that retained function and intelligence appearing across the galaxy. I saw the Imperium struggling to respond, unable to distinguish corrupted populations from loyal ones until too late. Infiltration and subversion replacing open warfare as the primary vector of chaos expansion. I saw Terra itself transforming, the golden throne cracking, as the Emperor's will was overwhelmed by the sheer weight of coordinated corruption. 7 billion souls times 1 million worlds, all screaming in agony while remaining aware enough to understand their torment. I saw the death of hope measured in incremental steps, each seeming small and manageable. The accumulated weight of them crushing humanity beneath inevitability disguised as choice. The tower was showing me why it existed, what purpose it served in the grand schemes of the Ruinous Powers. It was a prototype, a proof of concept, a demonstration that awareness and corruption could coexist in ways that previous demon worlds had never achieved. Every moment of those 7 billion conscious minds experiencing the torment of their transformed existence was data, information feeding into models that would optimize future efforts, refine techniques, identify the most efficient methods of inflicting maximum suffering while maintaining enough cognitive function to serve the long-term goals of chaos. They were learning from this world's pain. They were building something from humanity's anguish. And when they finished, when the research was complete, they would have a weapon that the Imperium had no defense against, no counter to, no hope of surviving. I pressed deeper into the tower, following corridors that twisted through angles that human spines couldn't replicate, passing chambers where things observed me with attention that felt like blades, flaying my consciousness layer by layer. The stone Mara had given me burned in my hand, its heat the only constant in a space where constants had ceased to apply. I focused on that heat, let it ground me, remind me of what was real and what was illusion designed to unmake my sanity. At the tower's heart, I found what I was looking for. A chamber, circular or possibly spherical, or maybe existing in shapes I lacked words to describe. Its walls covered in symbols that were also equations, that were also architectural diagrams, that were also living organisms that fed on observation and reproduced through understanding. At the center floated something that might have been a machine, or might have been a demon, or might have been both and neither. A construct of brass and bone and crystallized screaming woven into a form that defied categorization. It was recording. I understood that immediately and instinctively. It was taking measurements, gathering data, processing the suffering of 7 billion souls and reducing it to mathematical principles that could be applied elsewhere. It was the experiment's core apparatus, the mechanism through which the Ruinous Powers studied what they had created on Kyros Prime. And it saw me. The moment I entered the chamber, its attention fixed on me with an intensity that made me understand why Mara's people had described sanity-shattering as the fate of anyone who came here. It was looking into me, through me, reading the structure of my consciousness like text written in simple language. It knew everything about me in an instant. Every memory I'd ever formed, every decision I'd ever made, every fear and hope and doubt that had defined my existence from birth to this moment. It spoke, though speaking is too limited a word for what happened. It communicated directly into my mind, bypassing language entirely to plant understanding like seeds in fertile soil. "You are the variable we did not anticipate," it said. And the words carved themselves into my thoughts with edges that drew blood from synapses. "You are the observer from outside the experiment. Your presence introduces contamination to the data set. We must account for you. We must incorporate your existence into the model." I tried to speak, tried to activate the recording systems built into my armor that should have been capturing everything I witnessed, tried to do anything that might preserve evidence of what I was seeing. But I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly enough to issue commands to systems that suddenly felt as distant from me as stars scattered across the galaxy. The construct held me in its attention like a specimen pinned for dissection, examining me with curiosity that was utterly divorced from any emotion I could recognize. "You believe you can stop this," it continued, each word a violation. "You believe the information you carry will allow your Imperium to prevent the replication of our work here. You are incorrect. The process has already begun on 47 worlds scattered across the galaxy. We selected locations far from imperial centers of power, places where the Astronomican's light is weak and the warp presses close against reality's skin. By the time your Inquisition learns of their existence, the transformation will be complete. By the time you organize a response, we will have gathered sufficient data to optimize the process beyond your ability to counter." The stone in my hand pulsed harder, its heat becoming painful, reminding me that I existed, that I was more than just information to be analyzed and incorporated. I focused on that pain, used it as an anchor point the way Mara and her people used their connection to the planet. Through the fog of the construct's attention, I managed to force words through my lips. "Why? Tell me? Why not simply kill me?" The construct's presence shifted, And if it had possessed anything resembling a face, I think it might have smiled. Because you will serve us better alive, you will return to your Inquisition with this knowledge. You will tell them what we are doing, how we are perfecting the art of conscious corruption. You will warn them of the 47 worlds already in transformation. And they will respond exactly as we predict, exactly as we have modeled through our study of imperial behavior across 10,000 years of observation. It showed me then another cascade of visions that burned themselves into my memory with the permanence of scars. I saw the Inquisition's response to my report, the debates and counter-arguments and political maneuvering that would delay action for months, maybe years. I saw the fleets they would eventually dispatch, converging on the 47 worlds to execute exterminatus and cleanse the corruption before it could spread. I saw those fleets arriving to find populations that looked human enough, acted human enough, begged for mercy in Gothic that was clear and understandable, pleading that they were loyal citizens of the Imperium who had fought off demonic invasion through strength of faith alone. I saw the Inquisitors hesitating, their certainty crumbling in the face of populations that displayed none of the obvious markers of corruption, that passed basic tests for warp taint because their technique was too subtle for crude instruments to detect. I saw some fleets proceeding with exterminatus anyway, glassing worlds that might have been savable, while others held back and allowed the corrupted populations to continue their existence, spreading slowly to neighboring systems through apparently innocent contact. I saw the Imperium tearing itself apart over the question of mercy versus security, watching every decision become a gamble where both choices could be catastrophic. Every world a potential Kyros Prime that might be exactly what it claimed to be, or might be another experiment that would doom trillions if left unchecked. I saw the galaxy burning not with the obvious fires of open warfare, but with the slower burn of uncertainty and doubt, the corrosive acid of questions that had no good answers, the weight of choices where every option led to catastrophe just at different speeds. "We are patient," the construct said, its voice a lullaby sung to the tune of my sanity crumbling. "We have been patient for 10,000 years. We will be patient for 10,000 more if necessary. But we believe the endgame approaches. We believe humanity's faith in its own righteousness will prove to be the weakness that delivers the species into our grasp. You will help us prove this. You will be the messenger who carries our victory back to those who think themselves defenders of mankind." The stone in my hand cracked. I felt it break, felt the heat pulse once more and then begin to fade. My anchor was failing. The consciousness fragment that Mara had given me was being overwhelmed by the construct's attention, eroded by the weight of revelations that human minds were never meant to contain. I could feel myself starting to fragment, my thoughts beginning to scatter like leaves before a storm, awareness splitting into multiple streams that couldn't quite synchronize back into a single coherent self. And in that moment of dissolution, I made a choice that I still don't fully understand, that I'm not certain was actually mine to make, or if it was suggested to me by something else that dwelt in the spaces between thoughts. I stopped fighting. I let go of the desperate grip I'd been maintaining on identity and self-preservation. I allowed my consciousness to fragment, to spread out across the dimensions of perception that the tower existed within, to become temporarily untethered from the meat that defined my physical existence. I ceased being Hadrian Vex, interrogator of the Ordo Malleus, and became something more diffuse, more distributed, more like the citizens of Kyros Prime who had severed soul from flesh. And in that state, I saw something the construct had not intended me to see. It was afraid. not fear in any human sense, not emotion as I understood emotion, but something analogous that served the same purpose in its alien psychology. The construct and the powers that had built it were experimenting on Kyros Prime because they didn't understand what had happened here. The ritual that the planet's population had performed was not something the Ruinous Powers had planned or anticipated. It was genuinely novel, a mutation in the expected pattern of how warp corruption progressed, a wrinkle in the fabric of inevitability that they had spent 2 centuries trying to comprehend and replicate. They were afraid because humanity had done something unprecedented. A population faced with certain damnation had found a third option that no demonic intelligence had predicted, had rewritten the rules of engagement in a way that suggested free will still existed in a universe where predetermination seemed absolute. The conscious corruption model wasn't a weapon being perfected by chaos. It was a phenomenon they were desperately trying to understand and control before it became something that could genuinely threaten their long-term plans. Kyros Prime wasn't proof of chaos's inevitable victory. It was proof that humans could still surprise the powers that claimed to understand every permutation of human response to cosmic horror. It was proof that there were paths through damnation that led somewhere other than complete annihilation or total surrender. I pulled myself back together, forcing my scattered awareness to coalesce around the breaking stone in my hand, using the last traces of its heat to remember who I was and why I couldn't afford to lose myself now. The construct was still speaking, still flooding my mind with visions of predicted futures, still confident that I was nothing more than a variable to be accounted for. It didn't realize I'd seen its weakness. It didn't understand that by showing me everything, it had revealed the gaps in its own understanding. "You are wrong," I said, and my voice was stronger than it had any right to be. "You think you've anticipated every response, mapped every possibility, accounted for every variable. But you built your predictions on the assumption that humanity will behave according to patterns you've observed over 10,000 years. You didn't account for the possibility that we might learn, that we might adapt, that faced with a threat like Kyros Prime, we might develop responses you haven't predicted because they require us to change in ways your models assume we cannot change." The construct's attention intensified, and I felt layers of my consciousness being peeled away under the pressure of its focus. "You posit rapid evolution of strategic thinking across a species that has demonstrated remarkable consistency in its behavior throughout its recorded history. Your theory lacks evidentiary support." "My theory," I said, teeth gritted against the pain of having my thoughts dissected in real time, "is that you're so busy trying to replicate what happened here that you haven't considered what happens if other worlds find their own solutions, their own third options that you haven't predicted. You're preparing for the last war, building defenses against the Imperium, you know. But what happens when we become something you don't recognize?" The construct didn't answer, not in words. But I felt something shift in its attention, a momentary uncertainty that might have been the demonic equivalent of doubt. In that instant of hesitation, I moved. Not physically. There was no moving in the conventional sense within the tower's distorted space. But I triggered every destruct protocol built into my armor and weapons, every fail-safe designed to prevent inquisitorial equipment from falling into enemy hands. Crack grenades detonated, their shaped charges tearing through ceramite and the flesh beneath. Melta charges designed to destroy data slates and cogitators unleashed miniature suns that vaporized everything within their radius. My bolt pistol's magazine cooked off, each shell finding targets that didn't exist in three-dimensional space, but were real enough to be damaged by properly blessed ammunition. The rosette on my chest cracked, releasing the bound psychic energy that had been woven into it during its consecration, a burst of Emperor-blessed light that was anathema to anything touched by the warp. I didn't do this to destroy the construct. That would have been impossible with the weapons at my disposal. I did it to create chaos, to introduce noise into a system that depended on perfect measurement and observation. In the instant of destruction, as my body came apart and my consciousness faced the very real possibility of final dissolution, I felt the construct's attention shatter, its focus broken by the sudden cascade of events it hadn't predicted and couldn't immediately model. In that moment of distraction, I saw the real Kyros Prime. Not the corrupted demon world, but the world that existed in the shared consciousness of 7 billion souls bound to its substance. It was a realm of pure thought, a space constructed from memory and will, and the desperate belief that humanity could survive anything if enough humans agreed to pay the price. It existed parallel to the physical world, overlapping but not quite touching, a pocket dimension sustained by the same ritual that had severed the population's consciousness from their flesh. And in that realm, I was being pulled. The fragments of the broken stone in my hand had become tendrils, connections linking me to the vast network of awareness that permeated the planet's substance. I was being offered sanctuary, a place where my consciousness could persist even as my body destroyed itself in the tower's heart. I was being given the same choice the population of Kyros had made 243 years ago. The option to sever soul from flesh and anchor myself to something deeper than meat. I refused, not out of faith or devotion or belief that my soul belonged in my body. I refused because I understood, finally, what the people of Kyros had lost in exchange for survival. They were immortal in a sense, their consciousness persisting long after their bodies should have died. But they were also trapped, anchored to specific locations, unable to truly die, even if death became preferable to continued existence. They had chosen eternal awareness over oblivion, and the universe was making them pay for that choice. With interest compounded across centuries, I chose oblivion. I let my consciousness scatter, let the fragments disperse across dimensions I had no names for, felt my sense of self dissolving like salt in water. The last thing I remember thinking was a prayer to the Emperor, not asking for salvation, but asking that the information I'd gathered, the understanding I'd achieved, might somehow survive even if I didn't, might reach the Inquisition in a form they could use to prepare for what was coming. Then there was nothing. Not darkness, not void, not even absence. Just nothing. The state that preceded existence and would outlast it. The baseline condition of a universe that had no obligation to support consciousness or meaning or anything resembling purpose. I woke up 17 days later in the Medica Bay of the unrelenting vigil. My body more machine than flesh after the extensive reconstruction required to keep me alive. Captain Aldrich sat beside my bed, his face haggard with exhaustion. And when he saw my eyes open, he made a gesture I'd never seen him make before, touching his forehead and chest and shoulders in the sign of the Aquila performed with trembling reverence. "We thought you were lost," he said, his voice rough. "You were gone for 6 days before we detected your beacon, and when we found you at the base of that tower, Emperor preserve us, Interrogator, there was more of you outside your body than in it. The tech priests said you should have been dead a dozen times over, that the only thing keeping your brain functioning was some kind of external field they couldn't identify, like something was holding your consciousness together from outside your skull. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry, vocal cords that had been regrown from genetic templates not quite matching the ones I'd been born with. Aldrich held water to my lips, helped me drink, waited while I recovered enough function to ask the question that mattered. Did you record anything? The armor systems? Did they capture data? His expression fell, and I knew the answer before he spoke. The armor was slag when we found you. Whatever you did in there, it destroyed every recording system, every memory core, every piece of equipment that might have preserved evidence. We have nothing but your testimony, and you've been unconscious for 2 weeks. I'm sorry, Interrogator. Whatever you found in that tower, it died with your armor. But I was smiling, or trying to. My rebuilt face not quite remembering how the muscles worked, because I could feel it now. The thing I'd missed while I was waking, the difference in my perception that suggested changes more profound than regrown flesh and augmented organs. There was a pressure in my skull, not painful but present, a sense of something existing just outside normal awareness. And when I focused on it, when I turned my attention inward in ways I'd never done before, I could feel them. 7 billion voices, distant and faint but unmistakably present, speaking in a chorus that existed below the threshold of conscious hearing. The people of Kyros Prime had given me more than sanctuary in my moment of dissolution. They had given me a fragment of their vast, distributed consciousness, a seed of awareness that had anchored itself to my restored brain during the reconstruction process. I was connected to them now, linked to the network of souls bound to the planet's substance, carrying a piece of their existence with me wherever I went. I was no longer purely human. The ritual had touched me, changed me in ways that the Medicae scans would never detect, because they weren't looking for consciousness that existed partially outside the body. I had become a hybrid, like them but mobile, capable of moving beyond my anchor point, because my anchor point was my skull rather than a specific piece of ground. I had become a proof of concept that their technique could be refined, modified, adapted to allow for greater freedom while maintaining the core benefits of severed awareness. I had become exactly what the Ruinous Powers feared most. A human who had been changed by warp taint, but remained fundamentally human, transformed but not corrupted, different but not damned. We need to return to the nearest inquisitorial fortress immediately, I said, my voice stronger now. I need to brief the conclave on what I've discovered. And we need to establish a monitoring station here in orbit around Kyros Prime. This world needs to be studied, protected, kept safe from both chaos and the Imperium until we understand what it represents. Aldrich nodded slowly, though confusion was clear in his expression. We received orders while you were unconscious. The Lord Inquisitor wants the entire system cleansed. Cyclonic torpedoes are already en route from the nearest fleet base. Kyros Prime has been condemned. Interrogator. Exterminatus has been authorized. The chorus in my head swelled to a scream. 7 billion souls crying out in terror and rage and despair. They had survived 243 years of isolation and suffering. They had maintained their humanity through transformations that should have destroyed them. They had given me the knowledge and understanding I needed to report back to the Inquisition. And as reward for all of that, the Imperium was going to end them, burn them from existence, reduce their world to lifeless ash on the principle that corruption could never be tolerated, regardless of circumstance. No, I said, and my voice carried harmonics that weren't my own. 7 billion echoes speaking through a single throat. We will not allow this. There are things more important than any individual world. more important than any single population, more important even than the Imperium's doctrinal purity. Kyros Prime represents a possibility that the galaxy needs right now, more than it needs another charred cinder floating in the void. We will defend it. We will protect it. And if the Inquisition disagrees, then perhaps it's time the Inquisition learned that its authority is not absolute when weighed against humanity's survival. I saw the understanding dawn in Aldrich's eyes. Saw him recognize that I had changed in ways that went beyond flesh. That something fundamental about my nature had been rewritten during my time in the tower. I saw him reach for the pistol at his side. Saw him calculating whether he could end me before whatever I'd become had a chance to spread further. I am still loyal to the Emperor, I said before he could make that choice. I am still an agent of his will. But I have seen things in that tower, learned truths about the war we're fighting, that change the parameters of loyalty. The Imperium needs to evolve, Captain. It needs to adapt to threats that our ancestors couldn't have imagined when they laid down the doctrines we still follow. Kyros Prime is the first step in that evolution. Destroying it would be the single greatest strategic mistake the Inquisition has made in 10,000 years. He held his pistol halfway between holster and ready position, frozen in the moment of decision. What are you, Interrogator? Are you still Hadrian Vex, or are you something wearing his face? I smiled, and this time the muscles remembered how. I am Hadrian Vex, and I am 7 billion souls who refuse to surrender their humanity, even when the universe itself turned against them. I am proof that corruption and consciousness can coexist without one destroying the other. I am the variable that the Ruinous Powers didn't account for. The thing they fear because I represent a path they can't predict or control. I am the Emperor's mercy made manifest. The willingness to see humanity in all its forms, rather than reducing everything to simple binaries of pure and tainted. I sat up, my rebuilt body protesting the movement, but obeying my will. And I am going to save Kyros Prime, even if I have to fight the entire Inquisition to do it. Because that world and its people are too valuable to lose, too important to sacrifice on the altar of ideology. They survived the worst the warp could do to them and came out the other side still human in every way that matters. If we can understand how they did it, if we can replicate their technique with refinements that address its limitations, we might have a weapon against chaos that's more powerful than any fleet, any army, any superweapon the Mechanicus could devise. Aldrich lowered his pistol slowly. He didn't holster it, but he wasn't pointing it at me anymore. The torpedoes will arrive in 3 days, he said. You have until then to make your case. But Interrogator, if I determine you've been corrupted, if I see any sign that you're serving powers other than the Emperor, I will put a bolt round through your skull myself. Understood? Understood, I said. And thank you for the chance. It's more than most would offer. The next 3 days were spent in furious preparation, my mind racing through arguments and counter-arguments, building a case that could convince the inquisitorial conclave that mercy was not weakness, that preservation was not collaboration, that protecting Kyros Prime was in the Imperium's strategic interest, even if it violated every doctrinal precedent we had. I crafted messages to be transmitted ahead of us, encrypted reports that laid out everything I'd learned in the tower, every vision and revelation and understanding that had been burned into my consciousness during those eternal moments of dissolution. But more importantly, I listened to the chorus in my head, the 7 billion voices that had been waiting 2 centuries for someone to hear their story, to understand their sacrifice. to recognize that they were still human despite everything that had been done to them. They told me their names, their histories, their hopes and fears, and the small moments of joy they'd managed to preserve in bodies that should have destroyed joy forever. They showed me the civilization they'd built in the aftermath of their transformation, the art and music and philosophy that had emerged from a population that remembered being more than they currently were, and refused to let that memory die. They made me understand that humanity is not defined by the shape of the flesh, but by the persistence of consciousness that remembers what it means to be human. That no amount of corruption can truly destroy a soul that refuses to surrender its essential self. That the Imperium's greatest strength is not its weapons or fleets or faith, but its stubborn insistence on remaining human, even when the universe offers 10,000 easier paths. When the vigil translated back into the warp for the journey to the nearest fortress, I stood on the observation deck and looked back at the Kyros system, at the demon world that hung in the void like a malignant jewel. And I made a promise that I intended to keep regardless of the cost. Kyros Prime would survive. Its people would endure. And through their example, through the understanding of what they had achieved and how they had achieved it, humanity might finally find a way to fight back against chaos that didn't require complete annihilation of everything the Ruinous Powers touched. The galaxy would call me heretic for this. The Inquisition would probably condemn me. History, if it remembered me at all, would likely record my name as another casualty of extended contact with demonic corruption. Another good servant who fell into darkness because he couldn't maintain the absolute certainty that the war demanded. But I had seen what existed in that tower's heart. I had felt the fear of powers that claimed to be inevitable. I had learned that even demons could be surprised, could face phenomena they didn't understand, could be threatened by possibilities they hadn't accounted for. And that understanding, that tiny seed of hope planted in soil saturated with centuries of despair, was worth any price the universe demanded I pay. The howling sphere of Kyros Prime spins in its orbit still. A world that should not exist, but does. Populated by beings who should be damned, but remain aware enough to know they're not. It waits in the darkness beyond the Astronomican's reach. A monument to humanity's stubborn refusal to accept extinction, even when extinction offers mercy. And I carry its voice with me now. 7 billion souls singing in chorus below the threshold of hearing, reminding me with every thought that the war between order and chaos is not binary, that there are paths through the darkness that lead neither to salvation nor damnation, but to something stranger and more terrifying and infinitely more hopeful than either extreme. The universe is vast and terrible and full of horrors that would break mortal minds if fully perceived. But it is also full of humans who refuse to break, who find ways to survive that the universe never anticipated, who look into the abyss and decide that the abyss doesn't get to define what they become. Kyros Prime is proof of that stubborn human persistence. And I am the messenger who will carry that proof back to an Imperium that desperately needs to remember that faith without adaptation is just another form of death. The Emperor protects, they say. But sometimes protection requires us to become something new, something that our ancestors wouldn't recognize, but our descendants might need to be. Sometimes salvation wears the face of damnation, and mercy requires us to see past the surface to the consciousness that persists beneath the corruption. I learned that lesson in the tower's heart, paid for it with flesh and sanity, and the certainty that had defined my life since I first took the Inquisitor's oath. And now I carry it forward into whatever future awaits. 7 billion voices harmonizing with my own, singing a song of survival in a galaxy that forgot how to hope. This is what I found on the Howling Sphere. This is the truth that the Imperium needs to understand before it's too late. This is the gift that Kyros Prime offers to a species fighting for its continued existence against powers that have eternity on their side. We can survive. We can adapt. We can remain human even when everything about us has changed. And that possibility, that tiny fragment of hope wrapped in horror, might be the only weapon we have that the Ruinous Powers genuinely fear. The galaxy burns, but in the flames, something new is being forged. Something that might look like damnation, but feels like the first real hope humanity has had in 10,000 years of darkness. And I will defend it with everything I have left, until the stars themselves burn out or the universe finally learns that humans don't surrender. We just find new ways to persist that existence itself hasn't predicted. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is my declaration of a war that will be fought, not with bolters and bombs, but with the stubborn insistence that consciousness itself is sacred, regardless of the flesh that houses it. Kyros Prime endures, and through it, humanity might finally remember what we've always been. Survivors who refuse to accept that any question only has two possible answers.